Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar on Windrush Day 2022, when we shall be asking this question: the Windrush Scandal, what next in the fight for justice? My name's Adrian Locke. I'm the network coordinator for the White Allies Network. And let me just give you an overview of our agenda for this evening. A reminder of our purpose as a network and our journey so far in a minute. Very quick visit to race and racism in the news. We usually like to do that each time we meet, just to kind of keep our antennae up in terms of what's happening. And then our focus is the Windrush Scandal and the story so far. I want to show a couple of little videos from one of the Windrush victims, Fitzroy Maynard, but also I'd like to play to you David Lammy's speech in Parliament, which for me it was been one of the most impactful speeches I've ever heard in Parliament in my lifetime. And each of those only lasts a couple of minutes. So I'd like to play those to you before we hand over to Jacqui, who I'm hoping will be with us by that stage. And I want to give as much chance as possible for you to be able to ask questions of Jacqui a little later. It's incredibly, it must be the busiest day of the year for her as the main Windrush lawyer. So we're incredibly grateful that she's agreed to appear live for us this evening. And she's had so many TV interviews and other things to do today. So hopefully she'll be with us soon. We may or may not have a breakout room discussion later, depending on the timing, because I want to give as much time as possible to the questions that you might have. And when we come to speak to Jacqui a bit later, you'll be invited to just to flag up any questions you might have in the chat, and James will be looking at those in the background there. So that's the way our agenda looks, and we always going to keep things going from 9:30 onwards for a little bit. For those that want to stick around and just have an informal chat and catch up, we turn the recording off there, but up to that point we will be recording the conversations. But we do make sure that in the recording we block out anyone's faces, etc. So we'll keep that confidential for you. But if you ask a question, then obviously your question will be a part of that recording. So just be aware of that. If you prefer someone else to ask the question, stick it in chat, and then James will do that for you as well. All right. So just a reminder of our purpose as a network. We say we are aspiring to be true allies against racism. We don't take that claim lightly, but we are learning to be effective allies, is what we would say. And so the network aims to help us to become true allies of people of color in the fight against racial injustice, to learn about ourselves as white people, our histories, our privileges, and our impact in the world. Also to learn about people of color, their histories, their experiences, and their perspectives. But really, we want this not just to be a talking shop, but a place which develops ideas for actions that we can take individually, collectively, and in partnership with others towards racial injustice. Towards racial justice, I should say. But it's also just really important to point out that everyone is welcome at our meetings. While we call ourselves a White Allies Network, it's because we as white people are trying to take responsibility to educate ourselves and to take action. But everyone is welcome. We particularly welcome any person of color who's able to join us as a co-mentor that can journey with us. And maybe we can learn together, but we'll certainly learn a lot from you. So that's the aim of the network. If you haven't been here before, particularly warm welcome if this is your first time with us. A bit of a recap on what we've covered so far. So when we had our inaugural meeting just over a year ago, the group decided that we really needed to focus on filling in the gaps in our histories, because so many of us as white people had not really had a full history of empire and of the world at large. Very much a white-centric history that we have been taught at our schools. And so we drew from the likes of Clive Myrie, of Afua Hirsch, of David Olusoga, all from using BBC sources for that. We also listened into an interview with Satham Samgira, the author of Empire Lands. That was a Channel 4 interview. And then we looked at, we went east. We looked at the Opium Wars, and Irene Eng, one of our Council of Reference, helped us with that to unpack some of the history there and the impact on us today and a relationship with China and the Far East today. Really insightful session that was. Then the last session, another one of our Council of Reference, Neil Charlton, helped us to explore the partitioning of Africa, along with some BBC source material there as well. So we've had quite a rich journey up to this point. And I guess for the rest of the year, our focus is towards the present and towards action in the future as well, which is why we've got this topic this evening. But before we get into that, just a few pointers to racism or race and racism in the news that I picked up recently. This is a very quick visit for this, because we don't want to take too long on this and take it away from our topic. But the Rwanda issue continues, as we know. Whether or not that will eventually take off, literally, who knows, but there's plenty of opposition. Church has been opposed to it. All kinds of European and world bodies have been opposed to it. We need to wait and see on that one. Then a number of us were privileged enough to attend the premiere of a documentary, which one of our Council of Reference, Professor Robert Beckford, has been involved in, called After the Flood, the Church, Slavery and Reconciliation. That was up in London a month or two ago. Very powerful documentary there. And interestingly, a few weeks later, I don't think it was directly connected with that, we had the Archbishop of Canterbury on behalf of the Church of England once more apologising for the Church's involvement and investments in slavery in the past, and the amount of money in the investment funds within the Church of England, which actually probably goes back to those slavery days. And now it's probably the third apology I think I've heard from the Church. This one, I think they are getting towards action, saying, okay, now what are we going to do about it? And I think there's a growing call for reparations that have come from that. But also, my sense is that there's, in the Caribbean, particularly, the voices are much more strident than they used to be, much more assertive about the need for reparations. And certainly, William and Kate came across that in their visit to Jamaica not that long ago. And today, bring it right up to date, of course, we've had the National Windrush Monument unveiled in Waterloo. I don't know whether you picked that up on the news or not. And William and Kate spoke at that and opened that monument. And I'm pleased that William talked about Windrush Scandal, and to quote him, he felt that Windrush generation has been profoundly wronged by the scandal. So that's really useful that he's saying that. Got a political statement from a constitutional monarch, but hopefully that is just adding to the pressure that we need to be able to do something about this and see justice done. So those are a few of the things that I've picked up, but let's focus on our subject today. And just checking, can anyone confirm whether Jacqui has arrived or not yet? Don't know whether, James, you can confirm that. Have you seen Jacqui?
No, I haven't seen Jacqui.
Okay, well, I'm going to show a couple of little videos shortly before we go and speak to her. So let me just go on with that, and hopefully she'll arrive in the next few minutes. But just to really point out, this whole scandal is a scandal which involves real people. It involves individuals that have suffered terribly as a result of the scandal. And I just want to tell one of those stories just briefly before we move any further. And so I'm going to just stop sharing the slides at this point and go to just a brief video, which just lasts 3 minutes or so, which is the story of one man and the impact it's had on him. So let's just listen to his story now. For copyright reasons, we can't include the BBC interview with Fitzroy as part of this recording, but you will find the link to that interview on the YouTube page where you found the recording of this event. Our recording now continues after we have viewed that story. I don't know how that impacts you, but I can't fail to be profoundly moved and saddened by a story like that. Someone who shouldn't have to fight for justice, shouldn't have to fight to clear his name, but which should be the first thing that we do to compensate and correct that. Is just every time I watch that, it just makes me more and more angry. I hope it does you as well. Let me share David Lammy's speech, though, who just so profoundly expressed his anger at the situation a couple of years ago now. Again, we can't include the recording of David Lammy's speech recorded by ITV News in this recording, but you will find the link to the recording from ITV News on the YouTube page where you will find this recording. Our conversation continues after viewing David Lammy's speech. I've just seen that Jacqui has arrived. Welcome, Jacqui. It's really good to have you with us. I'm trying to see her on my screen. I think, yes, there is. I can see.
Thank you. Thank you. A million apologies. I've been on the tour all day with the Windrush, some of the 45 of the Windrush victims, and we've only just got back to base, and my battery on my phone died, so I couldn't even ring to alert you that I was running late. So it's been a wonderful day, but technological nightmares towards the end, so I apologize.
No, I mean, we are just so grateful that on probably the busiest day of the year for you, I would imagine, that you have been able to join us live. So I really do appreciate your presence here.
Thank you.
Jacqui, I know we've had limited a chance to catch up and talk about this evening. Can I just check with you? Are you okay for me to kind of go through some of the background that I suggested and then hand over to you, and we have a conversation after that?
Yes.
Or do you have a presentation you'd like to bring?
No, I'm happy to just.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll go as according to plan. Brilliant. Let me just share my slides again then, and I shall continue with the presentation. Okay. So make sure that that's. I often have difficulties with this one. Come out of that. And bear with me. Hoping you can see my slides there now. Okay. So we've just heard of Fitzroy Maynard's story. We have also just heard from David Lammy. As I said, I don't know about you, but I think one of the most impactful speeches I've heard in a long time in the House of Commons, and much respect to him for speaking up on behalf of the Windrush generation. The story so far, I wrote an article on this 2 years ago on Windrush Day, and I just want to kind of tell you some of the things that I gathered at that point and spoke about before Jacqui brings us up to date with what's been happening in the last 2 years in particular. But in fact, although I'm starting the story at 2010, talking to Jacqui briefly a few weeks ago, said the story goes back way beyond then, and I'm going to ask her about that leading up to 2010 as one of my first questions. But in recent history, 2010, the Home Office destroys landing cards collected from immigrants arriving in this country between 1950 and 1971. And for many, this was the only document that proved their date of arrival in the UK. 2012, the government announced the hostile environment policy. I don't know whether anyone remembers those vans going around with really nasty messages on saying we're out to get you. But this meant that employers, banks, landlords, the NHS were threatened with fines of up to £10,000 if they didn't check for the ID and proof of legal residence in the UK before offering services. In 2013, hundreds received letters from the Home Office saying that they had no right to be in the UK. Some were told to arrange to leave the UK at once. Now, shortly after that, the Home Office was warned that many Windrush generation residents were being wrongly treated as illegal immigrants, and that older Caribbean-born people were being targeted. Consequences were that the children of those that had been invited to help rebuild Britain after World War II started to lose their jobs and their homes. They had benefits cut off. They were refused NHS treatment, placed in detention centres and deported. Many had worked for up to 50 years in the NHS and other key worker roles. In 2018, and this was, I think, at a Commonwealth meeting, so everyone was actually in the same place at the same time, the heads of 12 Caribbean nations asked to meet the Prime Minister to talk about the issue. That was refused. I can't remember whether that was David Cameron or Theresa May at that point. But anyway, that request was refused, so very little sympathy or empathy there. And in 2018, over 5,000 potential Windrush cases were reported to Parliament. In 2019, the Home Office confirms that 164 of the Windrush generation had been wrongly detained. 83 had been wrongly deported, and at least 13 of these had died before the Home Office admitted the mistake. And I think the latest stats are, I think 21 have died before receiving any compensation. Jacqui may be able to update us on that one. In April 2019, the new Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, launched the Windrush Compensation Scheme, and the Home Office released the Windrush Lessons Learned Review Independent Inquiry Report, which I believe Jacqui may have been involved in March 2020. The conclusions were, this is the quote from, I've just lost the name of the person that wrote that. Jacqui will be able to fill us in on that.
Wendy Williams.
Thank you, Wendy Williams.
Wendy Williams.
Yeah, thank you. And this is the quote from her report. She said there was inexcusable ignorance and thoughtlessness in the Home Office. Foreseeable and unavoidable was this issue. Regulations were tightened with complete disregard for the Windrush generation. Officials made irrational demands for multiple documents to establish residency. They had no reason to doubt their status or that they belonged in the UK. In June 2020, actually before that, I think there were, no, we'll come back to the latest figures on that when we talk to Jacqui in just a moment, but there was a warning from Wendy Williams, that's right, a few months later, that there is still a grave risk of the scandal being repeated. So I'm going to stop talking there. I'm going to just introduce Jacqui to you. Jacqui has represented hundreds of Windrush victims. She was a member of the independent advisory group that delivered the Windrush Lessons Learned Review in March 2020, which resulted in the official apology from the Home Secretary. She's given oral and written evidence to the Home Affairs Committee on the Windrush Compensation Scheme. She's also got some well-earned awards and achievements. Power Media ranked her as number 10 in its Power List 2022 for her Windrush Scandal work. She's received a Legacy Awards Lifetime Achievement Award in 2018, the European Diversity Awards Campaigner of the Year in 2019, the Black Solicitors Network Small Law Firm of the Year Award in 2019, and the Black Excellence Humanitarian Award in 2020. Almost every year, I think she's getting some awards here, and the GG2 Outstanding Achievement in Law Award 2022, and then the last one I'm aware of, the Hero of the Year Award at the 2022 British Diversity Awards. So again, I just want to say how privileged we are that Jacqui can be with us today. And so I'm going to now stop sharing my screen, and we're going to just have that conversation with Jacqui that we have planned for this evening. So Jacqui, I can see your picture now, brilliant. Let me just, yeah, so I've just mentioned some of the key milestones in this scandal since the hostile environment. But as I said, you've talked about that you started long before that. And I'm just wondering whether you can tell us the story up to that 2012 point up, first of all. Just what happened before that contributed to this scandal?
Okay, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Adrian, very much for inviting me to speak to your audience. So most of you are probably very familiar with the Windrush scandal and will know that just 2 weeks ago, a report was due to be released on the historical roots of the Windrush scandal. It was commissioned following a recommendation in the Windrush Lessons Learned.
I think we've got a frozen screen.
Suppress it. There's now some potential legal action. from
Jacqui, we're getting some freezing of your
at the
screen.
moment. Some of us.
Jacqui, we're getting some freezing of your screen, I'm afraid.
Oh.
I don't know whether there's a...
Yeah, I don't know why that should. I'm actually in one of my offices, actually. I'm in a quite a stable environment. Is that, I don't know if it's,
Okay. Let's,
my phone is nearby. Let me move it away, because sometimes it is that still, is it still happening?
it's okay right now, so let's see if we can continue. So
Yeah. Right. So there was this report by James Southern which talks about the historical roots of the Windrush Scandal, and effectively the reason why the Home Office have suppressed it is because it talks about racism underpinning immigration lawmaking, and they don't like that word, racism. I'm not sure why they're so worried about it, because, you know, it didn't really need an academic to write a report. I mean, it was very clear that the 1962 Commonwealth Act was about taking away the rights from people in some Commonwealth countries, not all, and the people who appeared to be disproportionately affected were the people from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And at the same time, people from New Zealand and Australia and Canada weren't so impacted. And then we had the 1971 Immigration Act, which most people are familiar with. And again, that gave certain rights. Having taken away rights previously, that gave back some rights to people, again, from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, based on ancestry, but took away rights from people from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. And so, you know, the roots go back that far, but they also go back even further, because in 1948, and today we're commemorating Windrush Day, the 22nd of June, and you know the story, the boat has become a cliche of Windrush, hasn't it? You know, the HMT Windrush Empire came into Tilbury Docks, where we've been today, on the 22nd of June, 1948. But I don't know if you're aware that when that boat was actually docked in Tilbury Docks, before it anchored, so I was saying that 11 Labour MPs wrote to Clement Attlee, who was the then Prime Minister, and actually demanded that he turn the Windrush boat away, and so remember, those people on that boat, the people we're celebrating today, or the ancestors of those that we're celebrating today, so I think there's only a couple of them still alive, the descendants rather, were free men and women. They were not enslaved people. These were people who bought a ticket to get on that boat, responding to an invitation to come to the UK to help with the post-war reconstruction. They were known as British citizens, members of the United Kingdom and colonies. And so they thought that they were British people. They thought, you know, they saluted the king, they sang underneath, you know, the Union Jack. And, you know, it took Clement Attlee, and I say this because it is a Labour government at the time, it took, don't worry, I'm coming to the Tories and the coalitions, I'm not being partisan here, I'll go through all of them in a minute, but it took, you know, about 4 hours before Clement Attlee actually decided to let them in. And do you know what he was thinking of doing in the interim? He was actually thinking of turning that boat around and sending it off to East Africa so that they can work on a peanut plantation. This is 1948, 22nd of June, free men and women. And the discussions there, when we read all the research material at Kew Gardens, the research showed that, you know, MPs just thought we can't have any more Black and brown people in the UK. And then, you know, after that, we started getting the speeches from people like Enoch Powell and Mosley, and particularly the speeches of Enoch Powell fueled, you know, the Rivers of Blood speech, fueled the 1971 legislation. And although that came in under a Conservative government, the basis for it was laid again by a Labour government. So the roots start back then, you know. There are people who will be upset today that, you know, we're marking the arrival of the Windrush generation in 1948, but there were African and Caribbean, so it's not so much Caribbean, but there were African people in the UK going back to the Roman times. Archaeologists have found their DNA and their bones in ruins. And of course, we know there were race riots in the UK in 1919. In fact, one of the women that I was with today on this coach tour around various Windrush sites, a Black woman, her mother was born in England in 1913. And put that into context of the Windrush boat coming in 1948. They've got Antiguan and Barbadian heritage, so not all African, but Caribbean. So people have been here for quite a long time, often the more middle class group who were here as students in places like Oxford and Cambridge and the LSE, or soldiers who stayed after the First World War. So, you know, there's been a big presence, but there's been a big concern that we're here, you know, that my ancestors are here, and there's been quite a lot of campaigning to get rid of them. So we got the 1971 Immigration Act, which really stripped people of the rights that you were no longer, and in fact, they were never British citizens, they were British subjects. And they didn't know coming to England that that had a different status. So, you know, somebody born and brought up in Liverpool or Cardiff had a different status to somebody born and brought up in Ghana or Grenada. And they didn't know that. So they came, and when they arrived on those boats and walked those planks and, you know, places, they were, all sorts of things were stamped in their passports. And some of it was that you're a citizen of the United Kingdom and colony. Some said you're a British subject, some said nothing. Depends whether you were lucky to pass the report. Some people were given bits of paper, some were given vignettes and so on. There was a whole myriad of things. But a lot of people didn't come with a passport because minors in those days didn't need a passport. You just had an entry in your parents' passport. So they had nothing. And then we had another piece of legislation in 1981, which was actually enacted on the 1st of January 1983, the British Nationality Act, which actually took away the rights, what we call the birthers' rights. You've probably followed the arguments about birthers in the United States. You know, if you're born in the United States, you're American. But if you were born in England or on British soil or on a ship in our waters or whatever, you were British. But that was all stripped away on the 1st of January 1983. And you took the citizenship of your parents. So if your parents were students here or overstayers or refugees but hadn't quite gotten the status, etc., your children were no longer British. And that's why so many of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Windrush generation, because they had no way of proving what their status was, then their children couldn't prove theirs. And it's one of the reasons why we link deportation to Windrush. You know, the Home Office always say that they're not connected at all. But a lot of the grandchildren who are being deported, the Windrush grandchildren who have been deported on those ghastly charter flights to Jamaica and so forth, are actually the grandchildren of British citizens who, had it not been for this racist legislation that a British historian has now said is definitely racist legislation, meant to keep out Black and brown people, they too would have been British, which is why we draw the correlation. So, I mean, that's a snapshot through the immigration laws, and there's some in between. But it wasn't really until we got to around 2012 when we had the actual policy of the hostile environment. And remember, the hostile environment was actually a proper policy. It wasn't just a term that, you know, lefty activists and lawyers use. It was actually a stated policy. It was first coined again by Labour. They're not doing too well tonight. It was coined by them first, Liam Byrne, and then it became a policy objective of the coalition government, and then it became a manifesto pledge of the Conservative government. And Theresa May was Home Secretary then. She was Prime Minister you were looking for, Adrian, when the CHOGM heads of government meeting was going on in London. You know, she as Theresa May really decided we're going to make this environment hostile. And then you had all sorts of things. You had a real big change in legislation that made it very difficult to regularize your status if you're unlawfully in the country. And that made almost everybody, as Adrian said, it made absolutely everybody responsible. Landlords, schools, nurses, doctors, everybody became an immigration officer in some way, because everybody was required to check everyone's status. You know, and if people weren't sure of your status, they were erring on the side of caution, because the fines were quite drastic. You know, if you employed somebody who you shouldn't, you could get a fine of £20,000. Airlines were getting fined £10,000 if they allowed somebody on it who couldn't prove that they had the right to land in the UK, which is why so many Windrushers, when they went to the Caribbean to bury loved ones, they couldn't come back after the funeral. I've been with one such person today. She went to bury her husband in Jamaica, and she wasn't even Jamaican. She couldn't get back onto the plane and was stuck there for several months. So because she didn't have evidence of what her state, and people didn't think they needed it. They just thought, well, we're British, you know, we were invited here and we've been here for so long. We went to school here and, you know, got married here and had our first love here and all that sort of thing. Well, what do we need any bits of paper for? People just didn't understand until the hostile environment, where they, by actual legislation, 2012, everybody was becoming under scrutiny, and a lot of the Windrush generation got caught up in that, denied health treatment. One of the first cases that came to light was shortly before the scandal. A few months before it, The Guardian wrote about a man who was denied cancer treatment, who'd been in the UK since the 50s. And then there was, you know, the whole series of stories written by Amelia Gentleman in The Guardian from the spring onwards, that talked about people losing houses and jobs and so on. But worse than that, and I mean, it's bad enough to lose your job and your house, definitely, but people were losing their lives, people had died, and the human misery, it's just incredible. You know, I've been with 45 people today, and I was with Anthony Bryan and his wife, Janet McKay, who are featured in the film Sitting in Limbo. If you've not seen it, you should watch it. This is a man who'd been in the UK for, you know, from the 60s and tried to show that and had proof of his schooling here and so on. And yet he was still locked up in an immigration detention center. And I have to tell you, because I spend a lot of time in immigration detention centers and prisons by virtue of my work. And an immigration detention center is a far worse place, because it's a warehouse, it's a box, there's nothing to do, there's no libraries or education. He's in prison, you've got some facilities, and, you know, somebody wants to try and rehabilitate you. And usually, I know there are miscarriages of justice, but usually you know why you're there. But, you know, a lot of people in immigration detention centers have no idea why they're there. You know, they've come to see somebody, or they know they're British and they've been wrongly told they're not, or, you know, and they end up in those places which are just warehouses driving people mad because there's nothing to do. And he ended up in one of those places. So, you know, and then we come right up to today, and I'm not going to go on for much longer because I could go on till midnight on this subject, but I'm sure there's a time limit. We come right up to today, where we've got the Nationality and Borders Bill in Clause 9, which is seeking to have citizenship stripped from anybody. And yes, of course, you've got to commit a crime, and it's possibly quite a heinous crime. But anybody in the UK who has access to another citizenship, like Shamima Begum, maybe even if that country says you're not their national, you know, Bangladesh says she's not, Bangladeshi or Bengali, whatever the correct term is. But, you know, it doesn't matter. She's got some entitlement to it in the eyes of the British government. So off you go. And, you know, when this all started, this deprivation of citizenship business, and now it's without notice in the Borders Act, that's a difference because it's always existed. The idea was that you'd have to commit a really terrible crime. And, you know, and it was really going to be limited for things like treason, although I don't think that happens much, but also terrorism. And then we saw it creeping in, you know, people committed of sex offences, you know, the Rochdale groomers and people up north, those Asian men who were convicted of terrible, terrible crimes. But everybody thought, well, hold on a moment, we didn't know it was going to extend to that. And so where will it go tomorrow? And just today, you know, we're talking about a Bill of Rights in place of the European Convention of Human Rights, stripping away important articles like Articles 3, 6, and 8. So it's a very, very difficult time. And we don't, you know, see really any hope for the Windrush generation, because although everybody in the country, or most people in the country, I mean, I sometimes do get some hate mail every time I speak about Windrush, but most people in the country recognize that the Windrush generation have done nothing wrong in terms of their immigration status. And there's always this thing about good migrant, bad migrant, isn't it? They're always painted as, you know, these little old lovely cuddly people that came from the Caribbean, and, you know, their little funny hats and their little suitcases, and so as is depicted in Waterloo in the statue unveiled today, which is why so many people hate it, because they think it's such a stereotype. But that's another matter. But, you know, they came here, so people kind of think, oh, these are lovely people, why are we treating them like that? You know, someone's 87-year-old granny. You know, I've heard right-wing hosts on radio say, oh, somebody's 87-year-old granny. So they're different to the guys coming in on the dinghies. They're bad migrants. You know, we don't buy that narrative of good and bad migrants. But nevertheless, it's important in this context that they have been treated as ghastly. The Daily Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, all saying this is ghastly. Yet it's not been sorted out. We're 4 years on and it hasn't been sorted out. And everybody I was with today still has a really terrible tale to tell.
Thank you, Jacqui, for that overview. That is really helpful. And I'm just wondering, because it sounds like every Home Secretary that we get says, "Oh yeah, we'll put it right. We'll speed up the process. We'll make sure the payouts will increase the staffing, etc." What is the situation now? How many? Because this is so. I mean, because people are dying under this shame, aren't they? Without compensation, without recognition of the wrong that's been done to them. It's so urgent, it seems to me, that that everyone that's been affected is compensated as quick as possible. What's the situation? How many would you say have been so far? How many still to go? And what's the situation there?
Well, when the scandal first broke, the Home Office used data from the Office for National Statistics to look at how many people were registered in the UK on that day, census day, who didn't have a British passport and were, their country of birth, and they did some extrapolation and found that there was possibly about 50,000 people affected by the scandal. To date, they've issued status documents, because there's various stages. First of all, you've got to prove that, yes, you are a Windrush victim, and you get a status document, i.e. saying you're British or you're settled. So they're naturalizing you and making you a British citizen, or you are you've got indefinite leave to remain. There's all sorts of little quirks as to which one you get. So only 15,000 people have availed themselves of that so far. And believe it or not, they opened the scheme up to anybody from anywhere. So a good percentage of those are EU citizens who thought, oh, we'd go along and get free citizenship through the Windrush scheme. So that's why when you look at the data that they put out, this transparency data, you see French and Lithuanian and Polish people on it, and you think, well, they're not Windrush. It's because the scheme's actually open to everybody. So even less of the people affected by the Windrush scandal have actually availed themselves of immigration status documents. Compensation schemes data is even more woeful than that, because only about 2,500 people have even gotten around to applying. And I think it's because there's so many hurdles put in the way. When the scheme was designed by Martin Ford QC, he said there was going to be a light touch on evidence, and that the Home Office would have access to things like people's national insurance records and their, when they registered on the NHS, and that, and a doctor could tell them how long they've been registered and so on. And they've not really, none of that's really happened. And so they're putting people through the mill and asking for onerous amounts of data going back decades. In some cases, I've seen cases where Home Office are asking people for things going back to the 70s, and national insurance records were only digitized in 1976. So it's almost, you'd have to wait a year for somebody to go into an archive, and the Home Office themselves have no records going back that long. But they're expecting, people who are in quite a marginalized cohort, because the people affected by the Windrush scandal are actually a cohort within a cohort. The Windrush generation is a group, but there are lots of people who've thrived in that group. And most of the people affected by the scandal were the people who were less mobile. And so they perhaps didn't work as much, or they didn't travel as much. I mean, most people, if you didn't have a passport and you had children, even if it was the day trip to Boulogne or somewhere, you would have thought, well, I've got to go sort this out somehow. And so we found people in the Windrush generation who've just not traveled since they landed here in the 40s and 50s. And that's unusual. So you are talking about a deprived and depressed and a very, very vulnerable group who've had a life that most of us wouldn't really recognize. And even though I'm from that community, I was quite shocked, really, at some of the stories. I think, sorry, I've lost my train of thought on that, actually. I don't know why.
But I mean, just to,
where are we? So yes, so we've had about 2,500 people apply for compensation. Today, the Home Office put out some figures because they knew they'd probably get a bit of a bashing on, from some of the journalists who write on this. So they said that about 1,000 people have had offers, but that's still really low. That's still really low. And I happen to know, because I think I've got the largest number of victims dealing with. And that's because the lawyers working on this, we are caucus together, we talk and we share information and ideas, and we're in little WhatsApp groups and forums. So we do know. And, most people are getting offers that they reject, or that are just paltry, so it's woeful. Now, I attended the Home Office Windrush team's head office in Sheffield last week, Tuesday, by invitation of the Home Affairs Committee members. And that's chaired, it used to be chaired by Yvette Cooper, who was quite forceful with the Home Office on Windrush. It's now chaired by an MP called Diana Johnson, and people like Diane Abbott is on it. And they don't kind of mess around with the Home Office when it comes to these things. So it was quite a very interesting day, actually. But the Home Office did promise, they admitted to us that it is chaos, that there are delays, that they perhaps are ridiculous with the requests for evidence. They have promised to resolve it all. Their biggest problem, they said, was staff. They just don't have enough staff. But what was ironic in that was we were sat on the 4th floor in this building called Vulcan House in the middle of Sheffield. And if you had to go out, it was the day of the Rwanda flight. So I was very busy on that. And so I had to keep leaving the meeting to go and make calls. And I was doing a lot of media stuff that day. But each time I went out, I had to be escorted by someone to go and sit in this quiet room that they'd set aside for us. And when we were coming back on one occasion through this very long open plan office, I said, oh, is this the Windrush team then, you know? And they said, oh, no, it's the Ukraine team. So I said, oh, so where have they come from then? Where have these staff come from if you've got no staff to? And then, you know, they were all sort of embarrassed. And then they said, so I said, well, have you taken people away from Windrush? They said, no, they're internal secondees. Well, I want to know if you could find internal secondees to deal with Ukraine. And Ukraine's, it's necessary, the work's being done. And I'm not being divisive between communities here, but how is it 4 years on after the scandal, you can't properly resource the Windrush team? I think it's quite shocking. And my actual thinking about this is that they don't want to. It's not a priority. They think, well, David Lammy will get up and make some noise, but they know him too well that will die down, you know, once the cameras are off. And I'm not being flippant, but, you know, because that's politics, isn't it? That's politics. There'll be some grand speeches every now and again. It doesn't mean that they don't care about the issues. They do. And he does a lot of work behind the scenes. But generally speaking, you know, the political noise dies down and it's left people like myself and a lot of NGOs and very, very small grassroots community groups across the country. You know, there's the 2 ladies in Preston running a whole Windrush project up there, and there's one person in Nottingham, and you know, and it's you know, one guy who came with us today from Oxford, the Windrushers in the area of Oxfordshire, who, you know, and somebody from Bristol, and they're just trying to help on their own, unpaid. It's all voluntary. Everybody's working voluntary on this, and you know, and I just think the government really doesn't care enough to put proper resourcing into this because the numbers are small. I do think part of the problem why the numbers are small is because people just don't want to be bothered. They don't want the hassle of the Home Office, and they're not going to bother apply for anything. I've been doing a lot of, you know, pounding the pavements and going into what I call centers of influence, places where I know people will be. And some of them say, well, we've done 60 years without this, why are we bothering now? So there'll be a lot of that, and there'll be deaths and migrations and so on. So there'll be all sorts of explanations. But a lot of it is because the Home Office haven't really put the tools and mechanisms in place for people to be able, you know, the engagement's poor, and they've not put the tools and resources into the communities. When the EU, you know, just pre-Brexit, and they were inviting the 3 million Europeans, although I think they ended up with 5 million applications. They didn't really know how many people were here, but they thought there were about 3 million. They gave their community groups that deal with EU citizens about, so it was 90 million pounds that went to 50 community groups, and you know, to do the work. And I mean, it was advertised or sorry, promoted rather, but I knew about it because I worked very closely with one of those groups that deals with Latin American women. And they got one of these grants, and then they were ringing us up and saying, well, what's the law on this? And what do you? And I thought, well, how have you got this money? You have no clue what you're doing. So, you know, that money was just shredded out almost in the way that PPP or whatever it was, or was it PPE? What was the thing that the PPE, yeah, you know, money was just wasted. It was just totally wasted. And, you know, and in the community that deals with Windrush, nothing comes in. Last year, the government created a community fund for £500,000, and you can't apply for it if you're going to be doing any advocacy or any sort of work that might sort of have a go at the Home Office. So the sorts of people who get it are people nothing to do with Windrush, and they put on little films or little shows. There'll be a lot of them prancing around today saying, oh, it's Windrush Day, and waving buntings and scoffing cupcakes, but nobody's doing any real work. I mean, and I know this for a fact because a couple of them who've won these awards of up to 25,000, you know, have rang me up and said, oh, well, you know, if you've got any ideas what we can do. And one of them said to me, oh, well, we think we'll make a film on the Windrush. And they weren't anything to do with them. I mean, the Turkish community, nothing wrong with that. Anybody who can do anything worthwhile, well, fine. There's a group of people from the Turkish community who said they're making a film about Windrush. They said, could we come and interview you for this film? And I thought I was going to say no, because I thought this is just so pathetic. But anyway, I said yes. And so they came into my office in Farringdon and interviewed me. And And then they sent me a copy of the film, and I'm the only person in it. And they got 25, it was just me sitting having a chat with them. And so that's the sort of nonsense that that money goes, you know, the government. And so I reported that on Tuesday. I said, look, you've got to be serious. You've got to properly resource this work, because you are not committed to it as the Home Office, but there are people in the community who could help, who will find a lot of the people affected. They'll go into their communities and centres of influence, find them and help them get through this process.
Jacqui, I want to allow enough time for people with us this evening to ask questions a bit later. But just, so I've just got 2 more questions if possible. I want to come in a moment. I just want to ask what you think we can do, because this group is about action. It's not just about talking. We want to be able to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But before I get on to that, I just want to ask you a more personal question. I mean, just before you arrived, we watched a little BBC video of Fitzroy Maynard telling his story, and I just choke up when I hear stories like that. It's appalling what people have suffered. How do you cope with this kind of work is my question, particularly as, you know, it sounds like you suggested that some of your relatives and grandparents may have been part of the Windrush generation too. So you're personally very connected with people that have suffered in this way. How do you cope as a lawyer? Is it just that lawyers shut these things out of their minds somehow? But I mean, I'm just curious about how you cope dealing with such traumatic stories and events.
Yeah, well, we saw Fitzroy today, and it's very hard dealing with these cases. When the scandal, I mean, I have gotten more resilient as it's gone on, but when the scandal first broke, you know, there was some really, really horrendous stories. One of the worst stories I dealt with was a woman who was here from 1960. And so, and I give these dates because anybody here before the 1st of January 1973 should have had no problem whatsoever, as long as they could prove that they were here, because the laws hadn't changed yet. So she was here, and she brought, interestingly, 75 pieces of evidence to the Home Office to show she was here. And what was more remarkable about her story was that often when you're dealing with these cases, people's primary schools and sometimes even their secondary schools no longer exist, you know, unless you went to some posh place that's 500 years old or somewhere, you know, it's all been knocked down and become bijou flats or somewhere, you know. So I mean, like my secondary school in Battersea is now flats. So, you know, so it was very unusual with her to find both her primary and secondary school still around. So she had provided all of this evidence on her own without a lawyer to the Home Office, and they still disbelieved her, you know. And so she was asked to leave the country at Christmas 2017, and she did. She left because she panicked, and she became homeless where she was, and then what happened was she got into a relationship with a man, and she actually told me that she thought that that was the only way, was to get into a relationship so she could have housing. So she got into this relationship. He became abusive, and so a refuge found out about her and gave her the only refuge on the island, you know, put her up. And so she went in there, and then they said, well, actually, this isn't a long stay. You can't live here permanently. This is to see you through a few months. So she had to leave there and went living rough, and then ended up being brutally raped. And then the Windrush Scandal happened. And a friend of hers in England, who always thought something wasn't right about her having to go, rang her in Grenada and said, surely this is you, isn't it? And she managed to get, and her family, you know, didn't want to know her, nobody, because she'd gone down to the Caribbean with no money, and people, you know, just gave up on her. And they thought, well, no. So they contacted the Home Office, and the Home Office apologized and brought her back. And so she came back, and then, you know, she came to see us as the scandal broke, and her hair was all matted, and we had to take her. I remember she was appearing on Channel 4 News, and she turned up. Oh my God, come! I've got to go buy you a jacket or something. And you know, I had to go sit in a barber shop to get her hair cut off, and you know, and people were saying to me, "How do you deal with that?" And then she started telling me her story about the rape and everything. And maybe we are over resilient, but it does affect us. It does, and we've got 300 such stories. All the stories are harrowing, every single one, even if they don't reach that threshold of horror. They are all harrowing stories of some, you know, even, I mean, I've got a guy who, he just cries each time he sees me because he got stuck in Nigeria and he missed his oldest daughter getting married, and he missed one of his children graduating at university, and that was a first for his family. She was the first. And so, you know, he just breaks down, and it's difficult. It's very difficult. I mean, you've seen some of the stories, you know, because some of them have been sort of reeled out in the media, and there's some in the media today, isn't there? I've seen some in the Guardian, Independent. I think I've been quoted in a couple, but it's tough. But I have also worked on some really horrible things before. You know, when the Hutus and the Tutsis were fighting in Rwanda, I was very involved in Rwandan women who'd been raped in refugee camps, whose bodies were covered with cigarette burns and so forth. You know, women who'd got pregnant through the rape, and both them and the babies were HIV/AIDS positive. Involved in all sorts of airlifts, Jewish kids who were airlifted from Yemen. There was a community of only 600 Jews left in Yemen, and they were being stoned. And they lived in a walled community, and some of the Lubavitch Foundation, some of the Jewish communities in Stamford Hill, arranged with the British government and Red Cross to fly them out and bring them here, and then the parents would follow. I was very involved in that when I was a solicitor at Bernburg Pierce. They were doing that case. So, and the lead solicitor there, Nigel Leskin, was my boss at the time, so I was very involved. So yeah, so I've had lots and lots of years of seeing harrowing things, and I think you just fight. You don't break down. You just think, I've got to get justice for these people. And so it's fun, because when I'm now a partner at a city law firm, but I wasn't when I started the Windrush work. I was working alone in an immigration consultancy. That's why I won that small firm award, because it was just me and another half of a person. And we did 200 cases pro bono, because, you know, we just felt this is our community and we've just got to do something. So, yeah, you know, it's just tough though.
Yeah. Massive respect to you for being able to continue that kind of work. It's just, I couldn't cope. I know that I just couldn't cope with what you are having to face every day. But let's draw it down to action. We want to be a part, as I said, a part of the solution here. What's the best way we can have an impact to see justice done for every one of these victims? What can we do? What's the most impactful things that we can do you think?
I do think, I mean, I know it's a bit cliche-ish, but I do think writing to your MPs, because I think it's kind of gone off the boil a bit. It does always come back up on Windrush Day, you know, it does. And some people don't like that, because Windrush Day is meant to be about celebration of what the Windrushers themselves contributed to Britain. It's not meant to be about people having a moan. And a few people have told me off today for having a moan, you know, so it's meant to be a celebration, you know, if you're having parties and things. But I thought, yeah, but, you know, on every index of measurement of attainment, you know, whether it's health or education or jobs, the Windrush generation and their defendants have not fared very well. And post George Floyd, it was ironic it took an American case to have any impact here. There's all been, you know, maybe even my own appointment at a city law firm, I might be a George Floyd recruiter. You know, firms started taking the odd one person for the optics, and you know, yeah. And so there's those performative things that happen, but the underlying issues are still real. They're real problems. That inequality and inequity, which is the new buzzword that everybody's using, is real. But on the Windrush specific, I do think that we need to get MPs again sensitized to the need. So writing to your MPs, and also the social media, you know, tweeting, retweeting occasionally, because that really does get the Home Office focused when they do that. Because I don't know if you've noticed, the Home Office respond to people now on Twitter. You know, if you say so, well, we're trying, or, oh, well, that's not true. They've actually got, you know, it's probably a full time, and at all hours, which I find remarkable, because I'm an all hours person, and I sometimes see like 2 o'clock in the mornings, the Home Office has said something, I thought, who is this person? You know, so who's doing this job? So they hate it. They absolutely hate the attention. And they kind of think, well, there's Jacqui McKenzie, who's big mouth and always making a lot of noise about Windrush. And, you know, there's a handful of activists and there's a handful of lawyers who's doing it, but they'll make some noise and they'll go away. But it does need that groundswell of public opinion again, because really and truly the work to be done is to help people go through the process, and that's a legal process, you know, getting status documents, understanding how nationality law works and applies, or understanding how to maximize a claim. So there's two different types of law at play there. And that's the real thing. But in terms of the job to be done is to get the Home Office to start taking this a bit more seriously. And that can only be done by public pressure. And so allies have been brilliant, actually, in all manner of things. And if you look at sort of social media and Twitter in particular, it's mostly allies who help, propel this work to sort of to trend or to be front page news. And so anything anybody does, even if you just do one thing, just write to your MP and say, "Oi, do you know that these people are still waiting for justice?" It helps. Every single thing helps.
What about writing to the minister, the Home Office Minister, Priti Patel?
Yeah.
So.
Well. Well, I don't fancy your chances of anything happening there or getting, but I've got to be professional. I got told off the other day for not being very professional in a radio interview. Somebody wrote to my company and complained, but when they listened back, they didn't think I'd done anything wrong, so I was okay. But yeah, so I suppose I have to sometimes think, well, I wear the lawyer hat and be objective and so on. But you're not really going to get anywhere with Priti Patel. She's quite hardcore on being tough. However, I have met her in forums and meetings that she's invited us into on Windrush, and she seems to want to do something right by the Windrush generation, and it doesn't happen. So I would encourage you to write to her. Kevin Foster, the immigration minister, writes to the Prime Minister. I mean, the Prime Minister was very pro-migrant when he was mayor of London. I mean, I sat in meetings with him where he wanted an amnesty for anybody who was illegally here, because he understood that a lot of the undocumented people, I should use the word undocumented rather than illegal, because it's always a moot point about what that means, but people who have no status run this, run huge sections of our society in certain types of jobs and sectors and so on, and he realized that I mean, it's one, we've had to import, haven't we? We imported last year people from Barbados to pick strawberries because, there aren't enough people here, and Brexit's obviously compounded that. But, there's now a visa for butchers and a visa for seasonal farm workers. So they kind of know if you've got people who aren't quite straight with their paperwork, that they're still doing a good job and taxes being contributed and so on. So, and he was pro, but then when he read the country, he reads the country, and that's the problem. And that's where allies are really important, I think, because the only reason why, I don't know so much about the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, but certainly people like the Prime Minister and also Keir Starmer, the leaders of these parties, having really spoken to them really close up, are mostly pro-migration and understand the benefits that come from it if it's managed properly and so forth. They understand all of that. They also understand that this whole story about the boats and so on is a bit of a nonsense and a red herring, because there are 100 million displaced people in the world, of which 26 million are refugees and 5 million are seeking asylum at any day. And we get about 30,000 people, the third or fourth richest country in the world, and we get about 30,000 people crossing. And we're a signatory to international conventions. We have to have people, we have to take people, we're part of the global community, we can't shun our responsibilities. So they know the reality, but what they're petrified of, and which is why, Starmer, I mean, similarly with the RMT strike 2 days ago, and he told the front bench, don't go on the picket lines, he's reading the country. And I don't like the whole cliche about the Red Wall, but I had a previous career. I spent 20 years in urban regeneration, finishing as a director in local government. And so I've done all that Red Wall stuff, go around the former coalfield areas, where the mines were and so on, and seen how desperate people are. So I understand how they feel, that there's pressure, but we can't, but when they start to see people who are from the non-migrant community being receptive to the idea that migration can be important, can be good, then I think that's what's going to change the narrative. Because at the moment, they seem to think all white people are racist, they don't want any immigrants here, and so we're going to keep having an anti-migrant policy and keep bashing them. And it's really important that they hear your voices more than they hear mine.
Thanks, Jacqui, that's really helpful. And what I will do is I'll recirculate an article I wrote 2 years ago on Windrush Day, which has some links to how to write to an MP and a minister and the Prime Minister as well, so that if people want to do that, they can just have a few guidelines about how we can do that. I want to open it up to questions now, if that's okay, and then finally, before you leave us, I'd just like to ask a bit about your work with Caribbean nations in terms of reparations, because that's something we'd like to cover at a later session. But let's I'm going to turn to James now. I saw there were a few questions.
Whilst you're doing that, can I just, because my laptop was charging, was plugged in another room. I'm just going to quickly grab the charger because a little message just came up that my battery's going low.
All right,
Do
we'll see
apologise.
you in a
Okay.
minute.
So yeah, if anyone's got questions, say I've got a question in the chat, or put the hand up emoji reaction.
And I think Fred's got one in there, as well as a view on writing. So
Yeah.
so we'll come on to that in just a moment as well. But yeah, do put any suggestion you might have a question there in the chat. That'd be great.
Fred, did you want to ask your question about Wendy Williams?
Yes, sure. Oh God. Thanks so much, Jacqueline. It's great talk, really interesting. Oh my goodness, isn't it harrowing? The Wendy Williams report, there's a shed load of recommendations. Who's following up? Who's tracking whether they've been done? Who's reporting?
That's a really important question. So Adrian rightly said, I was a member of the Independent Advisory Group, and the Wendy Williams report, the Windrush Lessons Learned Review, was published in March 2020, just 2 days before the lockdown, actually. And then she had an advisory panel with us to do an update. She said she would do an update, and that was just published this March gone, where she found that the Home Office was still wanting in trying to implement the 30 recommendations. I think just before she published that report, there are 30 recommendations, and the Home Office had a community engagement with us and said that they implemented one recommendation, and that recommendation was to write a plan. Since then, they say they're working on a few others, but they're all problematic. One of them was to get this historical roots of Windrush written. It's been written, as I said, by James Southern, and they won't publish it. Some of us are doing freedom of information requests, and I'm thinking of legal action because it is in the public interest. The reason they've given to the Guardian newspaper as to why they won't release the report is they say it's not in the public interest. The public paid for it, and it's a recommendation in Wendy Williams's report. Another recommendation that's gone nowhere was that she recommended that they get a migrant czar, or somebody who would champion the rights of migrants. Well, that's gone nowhere. And another one was to train all the Home Office staff. Now, this is an interesting one, because Coventry University has won that contract, and they rang me and said, oh, can we subcontract something to you to do a bit of work? Yeah, but then told me that the Home Office said to them that they mustn't use the word racism. So, well, firstly, I had no capacity to take on work, so I wasn't going to be able to. But at that point, I said, well, there is no further discussion to be had. If we can't be, honest and look at what, if we don't find racism, then fair enough. The Home Office can't dictate to us that we must exclude that, which is why I think they've suppressed James Southern's report. But they probably gave him the same instruction. They're not happy that he's mentioned the R word. So it's all problematic. And most of the recommendations anyway are only about the culture of the organization, and that it must talk to people more or be more flexible. And those of us in practice are seeing no signs of that at all. That's an excellent question, because the answer is no, there's not much progress. And Wendy is now finished. So she did this update report, found that they were wanting. And we went out with her in the evening of the launch in March. And I said, are you going to come back? And she said, no, that's it. She's glad to be out of there. And so it's finished. And so who will continue to hold the Home Office to account for the recommendations is anyone's guess. I think we'll probably have to keep an eye on it.
Thanks, Jacqui. I think, is it Peter next, James? Peter had his hand up. I can see.
Okay. Yep.
Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, Jacqui, for a very inspiring and challenging talk. Could you say a bit more about the impact on different generations, and are there still implications for children literally being born today, as it were?
Yeah. So another very good question. So anybody born in the UK before the 1st of January 1983 is actually a British citizen by birth, or other than by descent, it's called. So they're okay. But you've got some parents who in the UK, so the Windrush generation often left children behind. So they started their families in the Caribbean or Africa, and sometimes in South Asia, but less so. That phenomenon is less apparent in South Asia, but there are cases. So they left some children behind. It was because maybe they had 4 or 5 children. They thought, well, they'd come over and get settled. Getting settled took much longer because, you know, the no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs. They couldn't get proper housing. And I don't know if you've seen the Small Island play or the film. There's a film, there's a play, there's the book. Andrea Levy, you know, have you look at one of the genres and see, because it's really amazing. It just tells you that story so well, but in a very sort of gentle way. So they left their children, and the idea was that they would send for them as soon as they can. And I've got that in my own family with older aunts and uncles who have that experience. And it took years. The children stayed with grandparents, but they took years and years and years to come. And so when they came, some of them came after the 1st of January 1973. So what was their status when they arrived? It wasn't very clear. And then they had children. So their children have no status. You know, throughout the 80s, under Theresa May, she actually had a Margaret Thatcher had a registration scheme where people could register, but a lot of people weren't aware of it or weren't able to do it. So lots and lots of people missed out on, and I only know about that scheme because I worked on it. I worked for the Grenada government, helping them. I was here in the UK as a student. I'd gone abroad to live and come back as a student, and was helping them to help Grenadians register at the High Commission. It was a free service they were offering for their nationals, and some High Commissioners did that, but some didn't. And so people missed out on that registration. So you find various generations with different status, mainly because of the dates they were born or the dates they came. And the reason why it's still happening to anybody born today, if parents haven't, if the parent came after the 1st of January 1973 and has just been here and have had children, and they've had children, then those children are no longer British because they were born here. They take the nationality of their parents. Their parents aren't British. Now, there are things you can do. People can register. There is a wonderful charity called Protect the Rights of British Children or something like that, run by a wonderful woman called Solange Valdez Simmons. And that's all they do, is try to show people who were born here who have no status how to get that status. There are some devices, but most people don't know about it. And it's a very expensive thing to do. It costs thousands of pounds to do. They recently took the Home Office to court to say that these should be free, and they lost on that. They won on some points, but they lost on the fees, although there's some reductions and things. So, so that's why you find it goes back to the stem of 1973, that if you come down the line, that, you know, 3 generations of people have no status, and so somebody born tomorrow to somebody at the end of that chain isn't actually British and could find themselves up for deportation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqui. We just got about 10 minutes left. Are there any other questions that anyone else has? Or that you can see, James, that I've missed?
See me? Vanessa.
Can you just clarify, Jacqui, please? Is it 1973 or 1983 that you were talking about just now? Because you were saying both of them.
Yes. So 1971 is the Immigration Act, which took away rights from their parents. So if those parents hadn't registered and then had children, so it's the 1971 Act, but it didn't come into force until the 1st of January 1973. So that's the first piece of legislation that took away rights from people who were CUCK, so citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. So they then had to register, and it gets more complicated because it also depends on what was in the constitutions of their countries when their countries became independent. So there's that whole independent movement. So some countries actually stripped their nationals of British citizenship without the British government having to do anything. So they're the first lot of people who had no status and then went on to have children, and their children have children, and that comes right up to today. So that's one issue. But the other issue is the British Nationality Act of 1981, that came into effect on the 1st of January 1983, that meant that if you were born, because all those people that I've talked about from the 1971 batch, if they had a child here before the 1st of January 1983, that child was automatically British. After the 1st of January 1983, you no longer have birthers' rights. You are no longer automatically British. You've got to take the nationality of your parents. And it was worse than that, because if your parents weren't married, you had to take the nationality of your mother. And so it meant quite a lot of discrimination as a result of that. But there's 2 separate pieces of legislation working almost in tandem both of them creating a class of people who could be born today with no status.
Great. Thanks, Jacqui. Time for maybe one more question before we draw things to an official close, so that people can stay on for a little bit longer and for a chat and a catch up after 9:30. Any final question? Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything. Or maybe I could ask.
Francis.
Sorry, James, carry on.
Francis.
Francis.
I was trying to type it up, but I don't think I was able to do it in time or quickly enough. But my question for now is quite a personal question, and I'm not sure if it was mentioned before already. But firstly, well, hi everyone, and hi Jacqui. Thank you for your coming and for sharing everything and for your insights. It's been very very informative for me and insightful. But I want to find out with your firm, your is it a solicitor firm, right?
Yeah, Leigh Solicitors.
Yeah.
It's a big human rights and civil liberties type firm.
So do you deal with cases of employment and housing?
Yes. Oh, employment. I don't think we have a housing. No, we don't have a. So it's huge. 700 people. I can't remember what everybody did. But there's definitely a big employment one because they're quite vocal and they're always putting out their newsletters and things. I don't think we have a housing firm. There are a couple of people in my department who do some housing stuff if there's a human rights aspect to it, the right to housing type of stuff. But no, we don't generally deal with housing. No.
Okay. I mean, the employment could be very relevant to me, but I was just wondering, like, how would I like contact your firm?
Well,
I
I think my details are available or through Adrian. I don't know if you're a network of people who all connect through each other. You can get my details of Adrian, or just Jacqui McKenzie at Leigh. You can find me if you just Google Leigh. I think you press on some button and you come straight through to us. So you can find me. Jacqueline is my full name, so Jacqui McKenzie. But I think yes, as it's showing up on the screen there, you can find me. I'm also on Twitter and things, and so just come through, and it won't be me dealing with it because I don't know the first thing about employment law, but I will find you somebody in the in the firm. There's a big employment department, so I will find you somebody.
Thanks, Jacqui.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Brilliant. Well, maybe I can ask the last question then about the work you're doing with the Caribbean nations at the moment that I've heard about in terms of talking about reparations. Certainly, I'm conscious that more and more Caribbean nations are getting much more vocal and much more assertive about this issue. Can you just briefly give us an indication of kind of how you see the direction going there?
Well, Leigh rather than me, so it's a different department. We've got an international department, have been very interested in reparations and did meet with some of the Caribbean leaders to look at how they might bring an action. I think it's fraught with difficulties, isn't it? Because, how much and who do you pay? And so it's quite complex. And does it need to be money? Could it be in scholarships? I mean, some universities are doing that, aren't they? I think it's one of the Scottish universities, and I can't remember which one, but they've given £200 million to the University of the West Indies to enable greater access and lifelong learning and that sort of thing. And is that better than putting money into the hands of governments? I was going to say something unprofessional there, but so yeah, but it's difficult. But yeah, I'm part of the discussions, and I lived in Grenada as a teenager to from the age of 13 to 19, so some formative years, and it was during the period of the Grenada Revolution. So I became a little bit of a political activist there. So I'm quite networked in with some of the leaders in the Caribbean. So we're in a WhatsApp group and we are discussing reparations. There is a reparations movement. University of the West Indies are leading it, Dr. Hilary Beckles. And so we meet with him. But I think it's fraught. It's very fraught. It's fraught from a legal perspective because, who, how, when. But it's also politically fraught because what is money really the answer, or is it something else? Yeah. It's not clear where we're going with it. Only that what we say is that the impacts of slavery, empire, and colonialism is ravaging those nations and their people to this day. And, you know, I went to the Bank of England exhibition on slavery. I don't know if you know that that's happening, you know, and they've suddenly admitted that they, and part of my roots is from Grenada, and it was quite interesting because that exhibition is only about Grenada. You know, the families that they held as enslaved people there, and the estates. And the estates, the sugar plantations that the Bank of England owned are just literally, you know, 10 minutes drive from my home. And you start wondering, and they don't have any family names, they just have the first names. So you start wondering, you know, about your own connection to these things. So it's pretty close to home. And, you know, there's people like Richard Drax, who's an MP, who his family own like a quarter of Barbados or something. And we're saying, well, you just need to give that over now. You know, did they buy it? Have you got any deeds? No, we'll give it over to a school or something, you know? So there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of things going on, but it's a really important thing. It's complex, it's difficult to know how to go forward with it, but we still have to keep having the discussion. Somebody might have a bright idea one day about it, because there have been reparations for the Holocaust, in other situations, you know, in other sort of worldwide I don't know, manifestations, you know, even when the other side have been the aggressor, you know, as in Japan and Vietnam and so on. So, although, I mean, I'm not talking about the Vietnamese War because they weren't the aggressor there, but, you know, so why, this is the only group of people of African heritage, the only group of people that have had no reparations for something that's so dastardly, and for something where the effects are still there today.
Jacqui, we're running out of time, but I just want to say thank you so much for the end of a long day and a lot of traveling around, that you've joined us and stayed this long. We really appreciate it. I hope you have a bit of a rest now. But I don't know whether you can do that this evening, have a drink or whatever you do to relax. But we really do appreciate you spending this time with us this evening. And I just want to, maybe we could just show a visual round of applause to Jacqui for everything she does, as well as just being here with us this evening. We really appreciate that.
Well, thank you all for having me, and do stay in touch, and you can all find me if you, if you need any more information, or if you want clarity on anything that we discussed today. I'm happy to engage via email or Twitter or whatever, and
Brilliant.
happy to come back, Adrian, do something another time.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really kind of you. That's really kind. Brilliant. I've just got a couple of slides to show before we stop recording, and then we'll keep the channel open for a few minutes as well after that. But just to share the resources, remind you on our website. Do sign up if you're not yet a member, either an aspiring white ally or a co-mentor, or someone as a person of color that's willing to journey with us. Do sign up, and so we can keep you in touch with our events. We have this hub of resources. There is now a whole series just on Windrush there. So a number of articles and videos that you've seen today will be on there, as well as some guidance about writing to your MP and your minister. Just so the last thing just to say is in terms of our next event, we are moving towards action increasingly. And so Claire Mathis of Impact Policy and Daniel May Miller will be helping us in October in Black History Month about how we might make a difference in the art of persuasion. And about that time, our Council of Reference will be meeting with our steering group to plan the rest of the program. And we're thinking about ideas about reparation, looking at whiteness, but other ideas. Please give us your ideas in terms of what you'd like us to cover in these sessions. Let's continue that journey of being a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to stop recording, and but keep the channels open.